Hello and welcome to Earth911's Innovator Interviews. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and today we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Graciela-Chichilnisky, who is one of the founders of the Sustainable Development Movement and has worked on the Kyoto Protocols as well as founded several companies, most recently Global Thermostat, which is a carbon capture technology company. Graciela, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. Now, you've been working in global climate change for a very long time. A lot of people still don't understand what it is that all of us who see the carbon dioxide problem rising are concerned about. Can you explain the basic physics that convinced you this was a problem 30 years ago?
Yes. I was the lead author for the United States into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the global authority on this issue. And the IPCC was given the Nobel Prize 2007 together with Vice President Al Gore when I was the lead U.S. author in the IPCC for the United States. In that context, I became aware of the enormous speed with which CO2 was accumulating in the atmosphere, going beyond anything that we had recognized. I had created the carbon market of the Kyoto Protocol, which I wrote into the protocol in 1996, and that was the right step. But when I recognized that the CO2 continued accumulating despite the great success of the carbon market, which is now operating in Americas, in Asia, in Europe, all over the world, I then realized we needed to actually remove the CO2 that is already there. It's too late to reduce emissions, but too much is accumulated. The basic science says that CO2 doesn't decay. Once it is emitted, it takes a long time, hundreds of years, to decay. Therefore, at this point, I realized that we needed to remove what we had actually emitted before, what was already there.
Right.
That may be what you call carbon removal, and it is the foundation of the direct air capture technology on which Global Thermostat is founded. I decided that technology was feasible when I discovered that there are substances, chemicals called amines, A-M-I-N-E-S, that naturally bind with CO2 at room temperature. Therefore, you don't need to apply heat, you don't need to have any expensive process. As long as you have the amine available, the CO2 will bind. The only thing you need to do is to use a bit of heat to separate it so that you first bind the CO2 to the amine, and then you separate the CO2 so it comes out as a 99% CO2, pure CO2 gas. And that's what our technology does. And I did that on top of the creation of the Kyoto Protocol carbon market, which I wrote into the protocol, because I thought that while the carbon market is the right step in economic terms, without physically removing the CO2 that is already there, we simply don't have time to stop the catastrophic effects of climate change that we're facing now.
But you've also really emphasized the economic opportunity in capturing the CO2. You have a book coming up, Reversing Climate Change, How Carbon Removal Can Resolve Climate Change and Fix the Economy. Now, how do you see the transition from our carbon-based economy beginning and really accelerating? And it sounds like the global thermostat technology is very well placed to be one of the catalysts. So what's the next step for us as an economy in terms of rethinking our relationship with CO2?
Great question. I tried to say just a minute ago that the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere doesn't need to be too expensive. in fact, our technology at Global Thermostat that we created, I'm the co-inventor with Professor Peter Eisenberger, which received many awards, is the lowest cost alternative for removing CO2 directly from air. Mm-hmm. And how low cost? You're talking in the neighborhood of $100 per ton, when many companies, like beverage companies, pay between $100 and $300 per ton of CO2. What that means is that you can actually make money by removing CO2 from the atmosphere and selling it. Selling it for what? Selling it for greenhouses that use a lot of CO2, selling it for desalinating water. Most of the water in the Middle East is obtained from desalination, selling it from the production of beverages and food that use a lot of CO2, millions of tons of CO2 per year, like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, etc. Mm-hmm. And also from the production of dry ice, which McDonald's uses to freeze hamburgers, because dry ice is CO2.
Sure.
And also for the production of polymers, which are biodegradable plastics that can be degraded so they don't affect negatively the oceans as the other plastics do. And the production of cement, construction materials, and carbon fiber. We are talking about a market that is about $1 trillion a year for the sale of CO2. So when the technology like ours is lower cost, you can use the CO2 that is now harming the planet's atmosphere. You can use it to produce money. You can use it in economic terms. You can use it for the markets I mentioned before, for food and beverages, for the production of polymers, plastics, carbon fibers, water desalination. And all of that means $1 trillion that is very voracious in its need for CO2.
And one we can simply layer onto the existing economy and start to replace the carbon-intensive processes that we use, it sounds like.
Yes. In other words, you can produce polymers right now, or polyethylene to produce plastic bottles. Okay. But you can actually use CO2 to do so. And in doing so, you will be removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And if you do biodegradable polyethylene, then those bottles will not be contaminating the oceans. So yes, what we're talking about is a process of changing the feedstock for the current economy in a way that preserves the environment. And is there a foundation for expecting that this can solve the problem? The answer is yes. In the year 1990, actually, the nations of the world signed the Montreal Protocol to reduce the emissions of chlorofluorocarbons that were causing the destruction of the ozone layer. Very harmful, because the ozone layer protects us from the damages of the radiation of the sun.
Right.
And after signing that protocol in the year, as I said, 1990, in a few years, commercial alternatives developed for chlorofluorocarbons so that we could do exactly the same that we were doing before with CFCs, but without them.
Right.
And those commercial alternatives, which were mostly used in the field of refrigeration, were really economically feasible, economically profitable. And they succeeded to the extent that these days you don't talk about the ozone layer. I didn't say you don't need to talk about the ozone layer. I'm simply saying that the problem has been resolved to that extent. So what we're talking about is now the Kyoto Protocol, which did exactly the same as the Montreal Protocol, putting limits nation by nation on the use of negative substances. In this case, it is carbon dioxide emissions. Once you put those limits, and you can trade them with a carbon market that I design and I wrote into the protocol, then you have the economic foundation, the financial foundation. But from the physical point of view, to move fast, you want a distributed system where just about everybody can get their hands on a way to remove CO2 from the atmosphere as a feedstock and make money. You really want to remove the CO2 that is so noxious in the atmosphere and could cause catastrophe, remove it, and make money out of it. Transform CO2 in the atmosphere to cash. That's what you want to do. And that's what we're doing.
And based on your distributed technology, so these are small installations that can be essentially co-located with a source of CO2 emissions, and like a cogeneration energy plant, as I read the technology description, feed off of that plant. So this is something that could be implemented on a small scale all over the place rather than having to be one large facility for a region, for instance. Talk about how we can get this spread out to everybody in the world.
Yes, I will give you one example. And by the way, just for your listeners and for you, I have to explain that I don't believe I know everything and I have the solution for everything, okay? Just to be totally clear. But I do believe we had a beginning of what is going to be eventually the solution, because according to the National Academy of Sciences in the US and the IPCC, direct air capture is the solution. Yeah. And the technology that we have, according to the National Academy of Sciences own reports in October 2018, is indeed commercially feasible because the cost is so low, sufficiently low. So how does it work? Well, how would you distribute it? Well, let me give you one example. Think of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has 950 bottlers all over the world. Each bottler requires CO2. When they don't get CO2, they have to close down, so it's a serious problem. Right. That happens to champagne producers, it happens to Heineken producing beer, and it is a problem. In the atmosphere, we have too much CO2, but on Earth, we have too little. So industry requires CO2. In what quantities? Well, if you look at the bottler of a carbonated beverage, you're talking 2,000 tons a year, 3,000 tons a year. Mm-hmm. This is very different from your old-fashioned way to do capture and sequestration of CO2, because it involves maybe $1 million worth of equipment, and instead, previously we needed huge plants that were in the billions that never succeeded to do carbon capture and sequestration. And the sequestration was always a question because it was supposed to go into geological cavities and it could accumulate and burp out, but now, instead of doing that, sequestering, we actually use it for commercial purposes, for a very voracious CO2 market that is $1 trillion a year. And here comes the point. CO2, as you said, can be produced in situ, just where you need it. You don't need to transport it, which is the most expensive part. Why? Because if you take it from air, directly from air, direct air capture, air is everywhere. And the scientific reality is that the air in this planet, all over the planet, has the same concentration of CO2, whether it is in Moscow, in New York City, Buenos Aires, wherever. Mm-hmm. The point is that's a property of the gas, which means the CO2 that can also be used to replace petroleum in the production of fuels. You can produce synthetic fuels. You can produce synthetic gasoline using CO2. You can produce desalinated water. You can produce, as I said, beverages and food. In reality, what we're talking about is a new economy in which carbon, the carbon molecule, is a critical fact and distributed fact, that equally distributed all over the world, accessible through this type of technology to be removed directly from air, to replace the petroleum that we remove from under the soil. So that new economy is, sometimes people call it the carbon revolution, can take the CO2 and make it into feedstock, can make it into synthetic fuels, can replace the production of gasoline, can use it to make materials, cement for construction.
And this can be done anywhere.
It can be done everywhere because the beautiful part, and that's the big difference with petroleum, is that CO2 is in the air distributed uniformly. Imagine how good it would be if petroleum was distributed uniformly.
Well,
you would avoid
a lot fewer wars.
A lot fewer political problems will be created. So I see a new economic development in which the feedstock, instead of being petroleum, is CO2 for all these enormous markets, and this feedstock is uniformly distributed in the whole world, available to everywhere. Free.
So we live in a mine, in a sense, that we can tap anywhere on Earth in order to produce the CO2 that could be the basis for plastics, fuels, cement, and all these other materials that are so essential to our business. We have a profitable model that is emerging, as you say, and at $100 a ton, that's already viable, but at 80 or 50 or 30 when it comes to scale is going to be very efficient. What's the barrier, do you think, to wider spread adoption? And I guess the second question I would ask is the current administration in the United States' resistance, almost irrational existence to anything having to do with climate change, actually probably the breaking point where this could turn into a tsunami of profitable ventures?
Well, Mitch, those are the right questions. What's the barrier? Mm-hmm. The barrier is time. Time. I'll tell you why. We are in a race against time. Everything you're talking about, everything we are talking about is going to happen because it makes sense economically. What about the current government? Well, quite frankly, many of your listeners don't know what I'm saying. That's why they're interested in hearing, I suppose. And neither do you until this conversation. So why would you expect the President of the United States, who is a common human being, to know more and faster than you do? They don't.
Oh, I don't think they do. Yeah.
That's right, they don't. And most people don't know. The barrier is time. We need to communicate. We need to develop, instead of the 3-4 plants that we have built, we need to build thousands. Mm-hmm. Actually, it is possible to build 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. By the time you build 30,000 plants of 1 million tons of CO2 per year, listen to this, you are actually removing from the atmosphere as much CO2 per year as humans are emitting every year. That is possible, and use it for commercial purposes. Now, it is a battle against time, which means that if we don't do this soon enough, it's too late. Yeah. There is a part of the equation. It's like in the Phantom of the Opera. It says the point of no return. Well, that is the issue. The point of no return. Just think about it. CO2 accumulates and it doesn't fall down, doesn't disappear, and beyond a certain point, the enormous tornadoes, the hurricanes, the floods, the fires, the enormous climate disruption that we are starting to observe are going to go beyond a point where they can easily be turned around. Time, that's the issue. So that is the problem. And how can we accelerate that? Well, this podcast performs a very important social purpose by informing people of what's possible. If you can make money out of this, as you can, then what stops people from doing it? Well, we need financial structures. We need financial systems. We need something that is similar to mortgages. The real estate market takes off when you have financial instruments like mortgages accessible to everybody. Then people go out and buy houses, right? And then the government contributes a little bit by making the interest in the mortgages tax-free. Well, that's great, yeah? Well, we need to do the same thing for the processes we're talking about here. So that the new economy has to be ushered together with financial instruments that make it available to everybody, like a mortgage. But instead of that, should be a carbon purchase agreement. And I can explain that, but perhaps on another occasion, how that works. And those are trillions of dollars. Yeah.
That's a very large topic, and I would love to have that conversation. But let's stay focused on this one, because I do think you're hitting the nail precisely on the head. We have a whole set of technologies. We've described this on the show as having not a global thermostat, but a global air conditioning system, and so that we are essentially beginning to control. Well, now that we understand what we're doing to the environment, we will begin to control it. And that your ability to have attracted a large amount of capital to this, so you have Ed Bronfman Jr., who I remember back when he was just the scion of Warner Music and I cannot remember the name of his liquor company, but now he is invested in this. He's working with you and other organizations to bring a lot of capital.
The company was called Seagram.
Seagram, that's it. Yes, of course. And it's so many years. And how much activity do you see starting to happen in the financial sector to make this an inevitability at this point?
Well, the problem is one step at a time. Mm-hmm. First of all, Edgar Bronfman has been extraordinary in his support of this technology, even though he's not a physicist, mm-hmm. and the support of the business model that we're talking about here. Because mm-hmm. the critical thing here is not technology. I mean, we have amazing technology. We can go to the moon. Yep. The critical thing is how to put this together with the economy. Mm-hmm. In other words, we need to make it so that people everywhere will have their ability to produce CO2, to use it economically, in the process remove it from the atmosphere, clean the atmosphere, stabilize the climate, and make a lot of money in a new economy in which the feedstock, instead of being petroleum for the development, is CO2. And that can be done. Edgar Bronfman is a visionary, and I have to say, I take my hat off at him and our other investors that contributed over $52 million so far and are continue to contribute to our technological development and to our business development. So this is what we have in front of us now, the development of a new economy. And it's a more egalitarian economy because everybody has the feedstock mm-hmm. available at their fingertips because it's everywhere in the air. Just think about it. If you have petroleum just by pulling it from air.
Yeah, can I ask an additional question that I think a lot of our readers are interested in, and that is, are there a lot of jobs involved in running those facilities? Because that's also another concern that petroleum-oriented people have, is that my job will go away. Will there be new jobs that will be a good fit for people in the current economy working at a facility that Global Thermostat operates?
Definitely, because just think of it this way. The CO2 that we remove we're not doing an environmental job. What we're doing is producing the feedstock for the mm-hmm. economy. Instead of removing CO2, think of it as extracting petroleum. That's what we're doing. Because the CO2 it's a mining job, except instead of mining from the soil, you mine from the air. Mm-hmm. And it's available to everybody. This increases employment and increases technologically mindful employment because it's not flipping hamburgers here. You are changing the economy. You are producing new fuels which are clean. You are producing greenhouses that provide faster growing tomatoes and vegetables. And I really want to talk about tomatoes and vegetables in this call because for humans, food is very important. And This is not just about high technology. So we're talking about everything we drink, everything we eat, to the houses that we build in, the boats that we operate, and the cars that we operate that are, instead of using metals like aluminum and steel, can be using carbon fibers that are cheaper and stronger. Mm-hmm. And all of that is the carbon economy. So I say, let's go do it. We're going to have more jobs. We're going to have more equality. we're going to have higher levels of clean consumption, a more stable climate. This is it. This is the carbon economy, and it's a future that is good for everybody in the planet.
Well, Dr. Graciela-Chichilnisky, thank you very much for taking the time, and we'd love to have you back to talk about the carbon marketplaces that we were discussing briefly. But thank you for joining us today on Earth 911.
You are most welcome. Hello to you and to all everybody who's hearing. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you. Folks, this is Mitch Ratcliffe. We've been speaking with Dr. Graciela-Chichilnisky, and she has a new book coming out, Reversing Climate Change, How Carbon Removal Can Resolve Climate Change and Fix the Economy. That's coming out in November, so keep an eye out for it on Amazon and at your favorite bookstore. As well, you can keep track of what's going on at Global Thermostat at globalthermostat.com. It's a fascinating company, and it's been a fascinating conversation. We'll be back with another innovator interview soon. This is Earth 911.